The grand halls of Buckingham Palace echoed with the sound of polished boots against marble floors, as Royal Guard Thomas Mitchell completed his morning rounds. For 15 years he had served the crown with unwavering dedication, witnessing countless moments of royal history unfold behind the palace's ancient walls. His record was spotless, his loyalty unquestioned, and his discretion absolute. Yet on this particular Tuesday morning in October, everything would change. Queen Camilla swept through the East Wing corridor with her usual commanding presence, her silk dress rustling against the ornate wallpaper. She had been in a particularly foul mood since breakfast, having received news that certain royal protocols were being questioned by the media once again. The constant scrutiny of her position as queen consort had worn thin on her patience, and she found herself looking for someone to blame for the mounting pressure. Thomas stood at his designated post near the queen's private study, maintaining the perfect posture that had been drilled into him during his training decades ago. His eyes remained fixed straight ahead, but his peripheral vision caught every movement in the corridor. He had learned over the years that the best guards were those who saw everything while appearing to see nothing at all. As Queen Camilla approached, Thomas noticed something unusual in her demeanor. Her jaw was clenched tighter than usual, and her hands were balled into fists at her sides. The morning newspapers tucked under her arm bore headlines that seemed to have stirred something deep within her. The front page of the Telegraph was visible, displaying yet another story comparing her to the late Princess Diana, a comparison that never failed to ignite her anger. "Guard Mitchell," Queen Camilla's voice cut through the silence like a blade. Her tone carried an edge that made the seasoned guard straighten even further, though he had thought such a thing impossible. "I need to speak with you immediately." Thomas turned to face the Queen, executing a perfect bow before responding. "Yes, Your Majesty. How may I serve you today?" His voice remained steady and professional, despite the unusual nature of this direct interaction. In all his years of service, Queen Camilla had rarely addressed him personally, preferring to communicate through her private secretary or other intermediaries. The Queen's eyes narrowed as she studied Thomas's face, searching for something that only she seemed to understand. "There have been irregularities reported regarding security protocols. Information has been leaking to the press about private royal matters, and I have reason to believe that someone within our trusted circle is responsible." Thomas felt a chill run down his spine, but his expression remained unchanged. He had heard whispers among the staff about increased scrutiny and paranoia within the royal household. Some said Queen Camilla had become obsessed with controlling every narrative about the royal family, particularly anything that might cast her in an unfavorable light when compared to Diana's memory. "I can assure Your Majesty that I have never broken my oath of confidentiality," Thomas replied firmly. "Every member of the Royal Guard takes their duty of discretion as seriously as their duty to protect." Queen Camilla stepped closer, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. "Yes, but some guards have been here longer than others. Some have witnessed things that perhaps they shouldn't have. Some carry secrets that could be problematic if they ever came to light." The implication in her words was clear, and Thomas felt the weight of his years of service suddenly pressing down upon him. He had indeed witnessed many private moments during his time at the palace. He had seen arguments, celebrations, moments of weakness, and displays of strength. But most significantly, he had been present during some of Princess Diana's final visits to the palace. Conversations and interactions that few others had witnessed. "Your Majesty, I'm not sure I understand what you're suggesting," Thomas said carefully, though deep down he knew exactly what she meant. The memories of Princess Diana's last days at the palace were etched into his mind like photographs, moments of truth that had haunted him for years. Queen Camilla's expression hardened further. "I think you understand perfectly well, Guard Mitchell. There are certain versions of events that must remain buried, certain truths that serve no one if they ever see the light of day. I need to know that I can count on your continued silence about matters that occurred before my time as queen." The corridor seemed to grow colder as Thomas realized the full scope of what was happening. This wasn't just about leaked information or broken protocols. This was about Princess Diana, about the secrets surrounding her final days, and about Queen Camilla's determination to control the narrative of royal history. The guard found himself standing at a crossroads that would define not only his career but his conscience. "I have always served the crown faithfully," Thomas replied, his voice steady despite the turmoil brewing within him. My loyalty has never wavered regardless of who wears it. Something in his tone, perhaps the emphasis on crown rather than queen, seemed to strike a nerve with Camilla. Her eyes flashed with anger, and Thomas knew that his carefully chosen words had been interpreted exactly as he intended them. He served the institution of the monarchy, not any individual's personal agenda. The Queen stepped back, her decision apparently made. I'm afraid, Guard Mitchell, that your interpretation of loyalty and mine are quite different. After 15 years of service, perhaps it's time for you to consider a change of scenery. I'll be recommending to the Palace Guard Commander that you be reassigned immediately. Thomas felt the ground shift beneath his feet, but his training kept him upright and composed. May I ask on what grounds, Your Majesty? On the grounds that I no longer have confidence in your discretion, Queen Camilla replied coldly. Effective immediately, you are relieved of your duties within the palace. You will surrender your security clearance and access cards to the Guard Commander before the end of the day. The dismissal hung in the air like a death sentence. 15 years of dedicated service ended with a few sentences spoken in anger and fear. Thomas knew that fighting this decision would be futile, but he also knew that his silence had just become far more valuable than Queen Camilla could have imagined. The news of Thomas Mitchell's sudden dismissal spread through Buckingham Palace like wildfire. Staff members who had worked alongside him for years were shocked by the abrupt end to his career. The official explanation given was restructuring of security protocols, but everyone knew there had to be more to the story. Guards didn't simply disappear after 15 years of exemplary service, without a compelling reason. Thomas spent his final hours at the palace collecting his personal belongings from his locker and completing the necessary paperwork for his departure. The Guard Commander, Colonel Harrison, seemed genuinely puzzled by the dismissal order. He had reviewed Thomas's service record multiple times, finding nothing that would justify such drastic action. This doesn't make sense, Mitchell, Colonel Harrison said as they sat in his office. Your record is impeccable. You've received commendations, you've never had a single disciplinary action, and your security clearance reviews have always come back spotless. What happened between you and Queen Camilla? Thomas considered his response carefully. Even in dismissal, his oath of confidentiality remained binding. I believe Her Majesty felt that my continued presence might be counterproductive to the current royal objectives, he said diplomatically. Colonel Harrison frowned, clearly unsatisfied with the vague explanation. That's not an answer, Thomas. I've known you for a decade. You're one of the most professional guards I've ever worked with. For the Queen to specifically request your removal suggests something significant occurred. The conversation was interrupted by a knock on the office door. Sarah Wellington, one of Princess Diana's former ladies-in-waiting who now worked in the palace archives, entered with a concerned expression. She had heard about Thomas's dismissal and felt compelled to speak with him before he left. Mr. Mitchell, Sarah began hesitantly, I hope you don't mind my intrusion, but I wanted to thank you for your years of dedicated service. You were always so professional and kind during difficult times. Thomas understood immediately what she was referring to. Sarah had been present during many of Princess Diana's final visits to the palace, witnessing the same conversations and interactions that had been weighing on Thomas's mind. Her eyes conveyed a deeper message, one that spoke to shared memories and mutual understanding of events that had never been publicly discussed. Thank you, Ms. Wellington, Thomas replied meaningfully. Those were indeed challenging times for everyone involved. I hope the truth of those days is never forgotten, regardless of what official versions might suggest. Sarah's eyes widened slightly at his words, recognizing the subtle but significant statement he was making. She glanced at Colonel Harrison, who was listening intently to their exchange, trying to decipher the underlying meaning of their conversation. After Sarah left, Colonel Harrison leaned back in his chair, studying Thomas with renewed interest. There's something you're not telling me, isn't there? This dismissal has something to do with Princess Diana. Thomas remained silent for a long moment, weighing his options. His loyalty to the crown was absolute, but his dismissal had created a new dynamic. Queen Camilla had essentially declared that his version of events was unwelcome, which suggested that his perspective might be significantly different from the official narrative. Colonel, what do you know about Princess Diana's final weeks at the palace? Thomas asked quietly. Only what's in the official records, Harrison replied. Her final visit was in June 1997, about 2 months before her death. She came to discuss arrangements for the prince's summer holidays. According to the reports, it was a cordial meeting with standard security protocols followed. Thomas nodded slowly. That's the official version, yes. But what if I told you that there were conversations during that visit that never made it into any report? Conversations that revealed things about the royal family that certain people would prefer, remained hidden? Colonel Harrison leaned forward, his interest clearly piqued. What kind of conversations? The kind that explain why Queen Camilla would risk dismissing a 15-year veteran guard, rather than allow him to continue serving in a position where he might be questioned about what he witnessed. Thomas replied. The weight of this revelation settled over the office like a heavy blanket. Colonel Harrison realized that he was being offered access to information that could potentially reshape understanding of events surrounding Princess Diana's final days. At the same time, he understood the tremendous personal and professional risks involved in pursuing such knowledge. Thomas, are you saying that there are details about Princess Diana's death that have been suppressed? Harrison asked carefully. I'm saying that there are details about her life, her relationships, and her final interactions with the royal family that don't match the narrative that has been carefully constructed over the years, Thomas clarified. Diana knew things, Colonel. She had learned things about the family, about their plans, about their true feelings toward her, and she wasn't planning to take those secrets to her grave. The implications of Thomas's words hung heavy in the air. If Princess Diana had indeed possessed damaging information about the royal family, and if she had been planning to reveal it, then her death took on an entirely different significance. More importantly, it suggested that people within the palace had known about her intentions and had reasons to want her silenced. Why are you telling me this now? Colonel Harrison asked. Because Queen Camilla's actions today have convinced me that the truth is in danger of being permanently buried, Thomas replied. She dismissed me because she was afraid of what I might say if pressed. But her fear has accomplished the opposite of what she intended. Instead of silencing me, she's motivated me to ensure that Diana's truth finally comes to light. Colonel Harrison stood and walked to his window, looking out at the palace gardens where Princess Diana had once walked with her sons. The weight of responsibility was crushing. As the guard commander, he had a duty to maintain palace security and protect royal interests. But as a man of conscience, he also had an obligation to ensure that justice and truth prevailed. What exactly did you witness, Thomas? He asked finally. What conversations took place that were so significant that Queen Camilla would risk everything to keep them hidden? Thomas took a deep breath, knowing that his next words would change everything. Diana had discovered something about the family's financial dealings, something that connected directly to her own safety. She had documentation, evidence that she had been planning to make public, and she had told certain family members about her intentions during that final visit. The revelation hit Colonel Harrison like a physical blow. If Princess Diana had been planning to expose royal family secrets, and if certain family members had known about her plans, then her subsequent death couldn't be viewed as merely a tragic accident. It suggested premeditation, conspiracy, and cover-up at the highest levels of the British establishment. 3 days after his dismissal from Buckingham Palace, Thomas Mitchell sat in a quiet cafe in central London, stirring his tea while waiting for his contact to arrive. The weight of the secrets he carried had grown heavier with each passing hour, and he knew that remaining silent was no longer an option. Princess Diana's memory deserved better than the sanitized version of events that had been presented to the world. Margaret Thompson, an investigative journalist with The Guardian, entered the cafe precisely at the agreed time. She had built her career on exposing corruption and cover-ups within British institutions, and Thomas's cryptic phone call had intrigued her enough to arrange this clandestine meeting. Her reputation for protecting sources and pursuing truth made her the perfect person to hear what Thomas had to say. Mr. Mitchell, Margaret said as she took the seat across from him, your call yesterday was quite mysterious. You mentioned having information about Princess Diana that has never been made public. Thomas studied her face carefully, looking for any sign that she might not be trustworthy. After 15 years of reading people's intentions, he had developed an instinct for detecting deception. Margaret's direct gaze and genuine curiosity convinced him that she was exactly what she appeared to be, a journalist seeking truth. What I'm about to tell you could destroy careers and possibly bring down members of the royal family, Thomas began quietly. But Princess Diana deserves to have her real story told, not the fairy tale version that serves everyone's interests except hers. Margaret leaned forward, her pen poised over her notebook. I'm listening. Thomas took a deep breath and began to recount the events of June 15th, 1997, the day of Princess Diana's final visit to Buckingham Palace. Diana arrived that morning earlier than scheduled. She seemed different from her usual visits, more determined, almost defiant. She had requested a private meeting with Prince Charles, but she also insisted on speaking with Queen Elizabeth privately. That's not unusual, Margaret commented. She often had separate conversations with different family members. The content of those conversations was unusual, Thomas continued. I was stationed outside the Queen's private study during Diana's meeting with Her Majesty. The walls in those old parts of the palace are thick, but voices carry when people become emotional. Margaret's eyes sharpened with interest. What did you hear? Diana had discovered financial irregularities in several royal trust funds. She had documentation showing that money intended for charitable purposes had been diverted to personal accounts controlled by family members. But more than that, she had evidence of payments made to certain individuals, payments that were designed to ensure her isolation and eventual removal from royal circles. The revelation was staggering. Margaret set down her pen, processing the implications of what Thomas was telling her. Are you saying that Princess Diana had proof of corruption within the royal family? She had proof that her own family members had been actively working against her for years, Thomas replied. Phone conversations had been monitored. Her personal staff had been reporting on her activities, and payments had been made to tabloid journalists to publish negative stories about her. Margaret felt her pulse quicken. This was exactly the kind of institutional corruption she had spent her career investigating. How did Diana obtain this information? Through someone inside the palace financial department who had grown disgusted with what they were witnessing, Thomas explained. Diana had been slowly gathering evidence for months, building a case that would expose not just financial impropriety, but also a systematic campaign to destroy her reputation and credibility. Thomas paused, collecting his thoughts before continuing with the most damaging part of his revelation. During her meeting with Queen Elizabeth, Diana made it clear that she intended to go public with her evidence. She gave the family 1 week to acknowledge their actions and make amends, or she would release everything to the press. Margaret's hand trembled slightly as she resumed taking notes. What was the Queen's response? I heard Her Majesty say, and I quote, Diana, you must understand that some secrets are too dangerous to reveal. The monarchy itself could be at risk. But Diana responded that she was tired of protecting an institution that had tried to destroy her. The weight of these revelations settled over Margaret, like a heavy cloak. If Princess Diana had indeed been planning to expose royal family corruption, then her death just 2 months later took on an entirely different character. The official narrative of a tragic accident in a Paris tunnel became far more sinister when viewed in this context. Thomas, why didn't you come forward with this information years ago? Margaret asked. Because I believed in the system, Thomas replied honestly. I thought that justice would eventually prevail, that the truth would somehow emerge naturally. But watching Queen Camilla's desperate attempts to bury any connection to those days has convinced me that some truths will never see light unless someone with direct knowledge speaks out. Margaret realized that she was sitting across from a man whose testimony could potentially rewrite modern British history. The implications extended far beyond Princess Diana's death to encompass questions about the integrity of the monarchy itself, the reliability of official investigations, and the lengths to which powerful institutions would go to protect themselves. Do you have any proof of what you're telling me? Margaret asked practically. Documentation, recordings, anything that could corroborate your testimony? Thomas reached into his jacket and withdrew a small digital recorder. I started keeping this with me during my final months at the palace. Call it intuition, but I sensed that events were building towards something significant. I have recordings of several conversations between royal family members discussing Diana's threats and their response options. Margaret stared at the recorder as if it were a bomb. The device potentially contained evidence that could bring down the British monarchy, or at least severely damage its credibility. At the same time, she understood the enormous responsibility that came with possessing such information. There's something else, Thomas continued. Diana wasn't just planning to expose financial corruption. She had also discovered evidence of intelligence service involvement in monitoring her communications and activities. She knew that her phone calls were being intercepted, her mail was being read, and her movements were being tracked by people who weren't officially assigned to her protection detail. This final revelation completed the picture of a woman who had found herself surrounded by enemies within her own family and under surveillance by her own government. Princess Diana's final months took on the character of a thriller novel, except that the stakes were real and the consequences were deadly. Margaret looked at Thomas with new understanding. "You're not just a dismissed palace guard, are you? You're a witness to what might be the crime of the century." Thomas nodded gravely. "And Queen Camilla's attempt to silence me has convinced me that it's time for that crime to be exposed." The following morning, Margaret Thompson's hands shook as she transcribed the recordings Thomas had provided. The digital files contained conversations that would send shockwaves through the British establishment and potentially around the world. She had spent the night listening to voices she recognized from years of royal coverage, discussing Princess Diana as if she were a problem, to be solved rather than a human being deserving of respect and protection. The most damaging recording featured Prince Charles speaking with an unidentified advisor about Diana's ultimatum. "She's become completely unreasonable." Charles's voice came through clearly. "Mother thinks we might need to consider more permanent solutions to this problem. Diana simply cannot be allowed to destroy everything we've worked to build." Margaret paused the recording, feeling sick to her stomach. The casual way in which permanent solutions was mentioned, combined with Diana's death just weeks later, created an unmistakable implication. She understood that she was potentially listening to evidence of conspiracy to commit murder. Another recording captured Queen Elizabeth's voice during a phone conversation with someone referred to only as director. The Queen's words were measured but chilling. "The Diana situation has become untenable. She has evidence that could damage not only the family, but also the government's relationships with our security services. Perhaps it's time to activate the contingency plans we discussed." Margaret realized that she was in possession of evidence, suggesting that Princess Diana's death might have been orchestrated at the highest levels of British society. The recordings painted a picture of a family and government apparatus that viewed Diana as an existential threat to their continued power and influence. Thomas had also provided Margaret with photocopies of financial documents that Diana had apparently gathered during her investigation. The papers showed irregular transfers of money from royal trust funds to accounts controlled by members of the extended royal family. More disturbing were payments made to private security firms and individuals with connections to intelligence services. One document particularly caught Margaret's attention: a payment authorization for $2 million to a company called Strategic Solutions. Led research into this company revealed connections to former MI6 operatives and specialists in what were euphemistically called security interventions. The payment was authorized just 3 weeks before Diana's death. Margaret knew that she needed additional corroboration before publishing such explosive allegations. She reached out to her network of sources within British intelligence and government circles, carefully probing for information without revealing the full scope of what she had learned. Dr. James Patterson, a former intelligence analyst who had become a whistleblower advocate, agreed to meet with Margaret at his home in Surrey. Patterson had spent decades working within the British security establishment and had grown increasingly concerned about the abuse of intelligence capabilities for political purposes. "Margaret, what you're describing fits a pattern that some of us have suspected for years," Patterson said after she outlined the general nature of her investigation. "There were always questions about the official investigation into Diana's death. Too many leads were never followed, too many witnesses were never interviewed, and too much evidence was either lost or classified." Patterson revealed that he had his own concerns about the events surrounding Princess Diana's death. "I was working in signals intelligence at the time. There was unusual activity in the weeks leading up to Diana's death, increased monitoring of her communications, coordination between different agencies that normally don't work together, and preparations for what was described as a high-priority operation." Margaret felt her investigative instincts sharpen. "What kind of preparations?" "Resources were allocated for an operation in Paris," Patterson explained. "Personnel were deployed, equipment was positioned, and contingency plans were activated. At the time, we were told it was routine security preparation for Diana's visit." But in hindsight, the level of preparation seemed excessive for a simple shopping trip. The conversation with Patterson provided Margaret with crucial context for understanding the recordings and documents Thomas had provided. What had initially seemed like isolated evidence of royal family corruption was beginning to reveal itself as part of a much larger conspiracy involving multiple branches of the British government. Margaret returned to London with a growing sense of urgency. She knew that her investigation was approaching the point where powerful people would begin to take notice and potentially take action to protect themselves. The story was too big and too dangerous to sit on for much longer. That evening, Margaret received a phone call that sent chills down her spine. The voice was mechanically altered, making identification impossible, but the message was clear. "Ms. Thompson, you've been asking questions about matters that are best left undisturbed. For your own safety and the safety of your family, perhaps it would be wise to pursue other stories." The threat confirmed that Margaret was on the right track, but it also demonstrated the very real dangers involved in exposing such high-level corruption. She realized that she was no longer just investigating a story. She was putting herself in direct conflict with some of the most powerful people in Britain. Margaret called Thomas that same evening, informing him about the threat and asking if he had experienced any similar intimidation. Thomas's response was grim. "They've been watching me since the day I left the palace. Yesterday, someone broke into my flat while I was out. Nothing was stolen, but the message was clear. They wanted me to know that they could reach me whenever they wanted." The escalating intimidation convinced both Margaret and Thomas that they needed to act quickly. If they waited much longer, the evidence might be suppressed, witnesses might disappear, and the truth about Princess Diana's death might be buried forever. "Margaret, I need to tell you about one more recording," Thomas said quietly. "It's the most important one, but also the most dangerous. It's a conversation between Queen Camilla and Prince Charles from just last week, discussing my dismissal and their concerns about what I might reveal." Margaret felt her heart racing. "What did they say?" "Camilla said that I had been asking too many questions about Diana's final days, and that my continued presence at the palace was becoming a liability. But Charles's response was what really concerned me. He said that if I became a problem, they could handle it the same way they handled Diana." The implication was unmistakable. Thomas had just provided evidence that the current royal family was not only aware of the circumstances surrounding Diana's death, but was also prepared to use similar methods against anyone who threatened to expose the truth. Margaret Thompson knew that she was running out of time. The threats against her and Thomas had intensified over the past week, and she suspected that their phones were being monitored. She had moved the original recordings and documents to multiple secure locations and had shared copies with trusted colleagues in case something happened to her. The pressure to publish her story was mounting, but Margaret also understood that releasing such explosive allegations required absolute certainty about their accuracy. One mistake could destroy her career and allow the real perpetrators to escape. Justice while discrediting legitimate questions about Princess Diana's death, Margaret decided to reach out to Henri Paul's family in France. Henri had been the driver of the car that crashed in the Pont de l'Alma tunnel, killing himself, Princess Diana, and Dodi Fayed. The official investigation had concluded that Henri was drunk and driving recklessly, but Margaret wanted to explore whether there might be more to his story. Through her contacts in French journalism, Margaret was able to speak with Henri's sister, Marie Paul, who had never accepted the official explanation of her brother's death. Henri was not a drinker, Marie insisted during their phone conversation. He was professional, responsible, and dedicated to his work. The idea that he would drive while intoxicated, especially with such important passengers, is absolutely impossible. Marie revealed information that had never been made public. In the weeks before his death, Henri had been acting strangely. He seemed worried about something, and he mentioned that he had been approached by people who wanted information about his passengers' movements and schedules. This revelation provided a crucial missing piece of the puzzle. If Henri Paul had been recruited as an informant, then his presence as the driver that night was not coincidental, but part of a larger plan. The drunk driver narrative served to deflect attention from the possibility that the crash had been orchestrated. Margaret also discovered that Henri had received an unusual payment of $120,000 francs into his bank account just 3 days before the crash. The source of this payment had never been identified, and French investigators had dismissed it as unrelated to the accident. However, when viewed in the context of potential intelligence operation, the payment took on much more sinister implications. Armed with this new information, Margaret returned to London and scheduled another meeting with Thomas. They met in a different location this time, both aware that their previous meeting place might have been compromised. Thomas looked haggard and nervous, clearly feeling the strain of the constant surveillance and implicit threats. "Margaret, I need to tell you about someone else who might be able to corroborate what we've discovered," Thomas said urgently. There was a Palace staff member named David Collins who worked in the telecommunications department. He had access to the phone systems and might have records of the conversations we've been discussing. Margaret felt a surge of hope. Independent corroboration from another Palace insider would strengthen her story immeasurably. "Where can I find this David Collins?" Thomas's expression grew grim. "That's the problem. David died in a car accident 6 months ago, single-vehicle crash on a country road, very similar to the circumstances that have become unfortunately common among people who might have had inconvenient knowledge about royal family activities." The pattern was becoming clear and terrifying. People who possessed information that could damage the royal family seemed to have an unusually high rate of accidental deaths. Margaret realized that she and Thomas might be walking the same dangerous path that had claimed other lives. "Thomas, we need to go public with this information immediately," Margaret said firmly. "The longer we wait, the more dangerous it becomes for both of us." Thomas nodded in agreement, but then revealed one final piece of information that changed everything. "Margaret, there's something I haven't told you yet. I'm not the only palace guard who witnessed the events surrounding Diana's final visit. There was another guard, Michael Stevens, who was present during some of the same conversations I heard." Margaret's eyes lit up with hope. "Where is Michael Stevens now? Can we reach him?" "He's in hiding," Thomas replied. "He contacted me 2 days ago, terrified for his life. He said that he had been approached by people claiming to be government officials who wanted to debrief him about his time at the palace. He refused to meet with them and has been in hiding ever since." Margaret understood that Michael Stevens represented both an opportunity and a risk. Another witness could provide the corroboration needed to publish her story, but it would also mean exposing another person to the same dangers that she and Thomas were already facing. "Can you arrange for me to speak with Michael?" Margaret asked. Thomas hesitated before responding. "He's agreed to meet with you, but only under very specific conditions. He wants to record his testimony and deposit it with multiple news organizations simultaneously. He figures that if the information is public and widely distributed, it will be harder for anyone to silence him." Margaret recognized the wisdom in Michael's approach. By going public with multiple outlets simultaneously, they could ensure that the story couldn't be suppressed even if something happened to any individual journalist or news organization. That evening, Margaret worked late into the night preparing her story for publication. She had decided to release it as a multi-part investigation, with each installment building upon the previous revelations. The first article would focus on Thomas's dismissal and his allegations about Queen Camilla's motivations. Subsequent articles would detail the recordings, documents, and witness testimony that supported claims of a conspiracy surrounding Princess Diana's death. As Margaret wrote, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was documenting one of the most significant cover-ups in modern history. The evidence suggested that Princess Diana had been murdered not by random criminals or terrorists, but by the very institution she had married into and the government that was supposed to protect her. The story would not only seek justice for Princess Diana but also expose the corrupt system that had enabled her death and then covered it up for decades. Margaret knew that publication would make her a target, but she also understood that silence would make her complicit in the ongoing injustice. Her final act before submitting the story was to create multiple backup copies of all evidence and distribute them to trusted colleagues around the world. If something happened to her, the truth about Princess Diana would still see the light of day. The morning of publication arrived with unprecedented tension across London. Margaret Thompson's investigation into Princess Diana's death was set to be released simultaneously by The Guardian, The New York Times, and Le Monde, ensuring that no single government could suppress the story. News organizations around the world had prepared special coverage, understanding that the revelations would send shockwaves through the British establishment and beyond. At Buckingham Palace, emergency meetings had been called throughout the night. Queen Camilla paced frantically in her private chambers, realizing that her attempt to silence Thomas Mitchell had backfired spectacularly. Instead of eliminating a potential threat, she had created a determined enemy with access to devastating evidence. King Charles sat in his study, staring at advance copies of the articles that palace contacts had managed to obtain. The recordings of his own voice discussing permanent solutions to the Diana problem played back in his mind like a nightmare that refused to end. His legal advisors had already informed him that the evidence could potentially support criminal charges for conspiracy to commit murder. The first article was published online at exactly 6 a.m. London time. Within minutes, the story had been shared thousands of times across social media platforms. The headline read, "Diana's Truth. New evidence suggests princess was murdered to prevent royal scandal exposure." Margaret had crafted the opening carefully, beginning with Thomas Mitchell's dismissal and Queen Camilla's apparent fear of what he might reveal. The article then methodically presented the evidence: the recordings of royal family conversations, the financial documents showing suspicious payments, and testimony from multiple palace insiders who had witnessed Diana's final confrontation with the family. Public reaction was immediate and explosive. Crowds began gathering outside Buckingham Palace within hours of publication, demanding answers from the royal family. Social media was flooded with expressions of outrage, calls for justice, and demands for a new investigation into Diana's death. The hashtag #TheJusticeForDiana began trending worldwide. The British government's response was swift but chaotic. The Prime Minister called an emergency cabinet meeting to discuss the crisis. Intelligence services were reportedly scrambling to assess the damage to their operations and identify other potential witnesses who might come forward. Parliament faced immediate pressure to launch a formal inquiry into the allegations. Thomas Mitchell, who had been in hiding since the threats against him intensified, finally felt safe enough to emerge and speak publicly. At a press conference organized by Margaret Thompson, he stood before cameras and repeated his allegations with calm certainty. "I served the crown faithfully for 15 years, he said. But my loyalty was to the institution of the monarchy, not to individuals who would abuse their power to commit murder." The recordings provided by Thomas were played for the press, allowing journalists around the world to hear the voices of senior royals discussing Diana as a problem to be eliminated. The audio quality was clear enough that voice analysis experts could confirm the authenticity of the conversations, removing any doubt about their legitimacy. Michael Stevens, the second palace guard who had witnessed Diana's final days, finally came out of hiding to corroborate Thomas's testimony. His account of the conversations and events surrounding Diana's last visit to Buckingham Palace matched Thomas's version in every crucial detail, providing the independent verification that made the story unassailable. Queen Camilla's role in attempting to suppress the evidence became a particular focus of public anger. Her dismissal of Thomas Mitchell was seen as proof that she had known about the conspiracy and had actively worked to cover it up. Calls for her abdication began almost immediately, with protesters gathering outside her public appearances demanding her removal. The international response was equally dramatic. The French government announced that it would reopen its investigation into the Paris car crash, focusing specifically on new evidence about Henri Paul's recruitment as an informant and the suspicious payment he had received. The European Parliament called for a comprehensive investigation into intelligence service activities related to Diana's death. As the story developed over the following days, additional witnesses began coming forward. Palace staff members who had remained silent for decades found the courage to share their own observations and suspicions. Intelligence service whistleblowers provided context about the surveillance operations that had been conducted against Diana in her final months. The monarchy found itself facing its greatest crisis since the abdication of Edward VIII in 1936. Public support for the royal family plummeted as people processed the implications of the evidence. The institution that had been built on traditions of service and dignity was revealed to have been capable of the most heinous betrayal of those same values. Margaret Thompson's investigation had achieved more than just exposing the truth about Princess Diana's death. It had demonstrated the power of journalism to hold even the most powerful institutions accountable for their actions. The story became a watershed moment in British media history, showing that no one was above the law or beyond the reach of justice. As legal proceedings began and official investigations were launched, Thomas Mitchell reflected on the journey that had brought him from loyal palace guard to key witness in one of the most significant scandals in British history. Queen Camilla's attempt to throw him out had indeed revealed the truth about Princess Diana, but not in the way she had intended. The palace guard who had once sworn to protect the crown had ultimately protected something far more important, the truth itself. Princess Diana's voice, silenced for more than 2 decades, had finally been heard through the courage of those who refused to let her story be buried with her. Justice for Diana was no longer just a hope. It was becoming a reality, one revelation at a time.